Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is the B Block, and I am Alaina Pinto. This is the international block of our weekly program, and we start with Ben Stevens, the editor of the Business of Cannabis at Prohibition Partners. Ben.
I'm Ben Stevens with Business of Cannabis with this week's European report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The rise of cannabis telemedicine has been one of the biggest growth drivers in medical cannabis since the initial green rush of 2018. A wave of online clinics has spread across the world's fastest growing markets, like the UK, Poland, Germany, and Australia, but now it appears that wave is beginning to break. This week, Germany and Australia both moved to impose strict new limits on how cannabis can be prescribed online, targeting what regulators call single-issue telehealth models, or online clinics with the single purpose of providing medical cannabis to as many patients as possible. Germany issued a draft bill proposing to ban mail-order prescriptions, meaning cannabis flower would no longer be able to be sent directly to patients' homes. Furthermore, prescribing doctors would now be required to hold in-person consultations at least once every 3 months and at least once before a new patient is approved for treatment. It's part of a long-touted push by the new government to rein in the booming cannabis prescription market. In Australia, which has seen similar levels of growth thanks to online clinics, regulators have now also issued strict new guidelines, making it clear that they intend to prosecute anybody who flaunts them. The AHPRA are now investigating dozens of practitioners, and many have already been banned. This followed new research which found just 8 practitioners had issued more than 10,000 prescriptions over a 6-month period, including a single prescriber who issued over 17,000 prescriptions by themselves. For a preview of what might come next, all eyes are on Poland, where a telemedicine crackdown was introduced in November 2024, initially designed to address an opioid prescribing crisis, but later including cannabis because of its rapid growth. Before the change, Poland was issuing more than 70,000 cannabis prescriptions a month. Just 2 months later, this had left more than half to 33,000. Although there has been some recovery since, many legitimate patients, particularly in rural areas, are now left without ready access to treatment. This has sparked fervent debate around exactly where the line sits between medical and recreational, and whether a sustainable, highly regulated growth in the market is really what the industry needs rather than its recent influx of cash. That's all for this week from me and Business of Cannabis. I'm Ben Stevens, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
I'm Dave Barton from Thermidor with your UK Cannabis report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The UK's National Health Service, the NHS, will soon publish medical cannabis data for the first time since it was set up 4 years ago. At least that's the hope. After a formal review of medical cannabis by NHS England in 2019, the NHS Cannabis Patient Registry was set up on the 1st of April 2021, following recommendations for the development of a patient registry for the clinicians to collect uniform data on CBPM use in the UK. However, according to experts, the registry is never discussed in medical cannabis circles, casting doubt over its actual existence, according to Business of Cannabis. While registry officials have announced data will be available by the end of the year, the data will only include the 1,000 or so patients receiving 3 NHS-approved medications, Sativex, Epidiolex, and Nabilone. Data from private clinic patients, who form the majority of the UK medical cannabis market, will not be included in the registry report. That's all for this week's UK report. I'm Dave Barton from Thermidor, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The last 2 years have been sobering for the entire cannabis industry, and now a report from the San Diego Post has some news about the valuations of some of the biggest multi-state operators and how the crash has occurred so fast. Some companies are packing it in to minimize their losses. 2 years ago, the big 4 MSOs, Curaleaf, Tilray, Cresco Labs, and Green Thumb Industries were valued at $37 billion. Now, the valuations for those four companies is down to just $4 billion. The only two states to move forward with adult use over the past 2 years is Ohio and Minnesota, and the race to become the 25th adult use state has stalled, even though Pennsylvania continues to be the odds-on favorite to get that done this year through a legislative initiative led by their governor. So, what happened to the Green Rush? Coming out of the pandemic, where many states allowed the cannabis industry to survive as an essential medicine to its patients, the growth of the market has stalled. Or in the case of New York, over 300 licenses for dispensaries were issued only to see the price of flower plunge. The same thing is happening in Massachusetts, where 36 dispensaries have closed over the past year. But still, there is hope for some in the Bay State, as Curtis Emery explains in his Massachusetts report this week.
I'm Curtis Emery, a bud tender from Resonate in Worcester, Massachusetts, with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The state Senate will vote next week on Bill 1148, titled An Act Relevant to the Fair Treatment of Employees. This bill aims to protect employees and prospective employees from discriminatory hiring practices based on recreational cannabis use. The bill will not provide protections for those whose credentials or licenses are compromised by the use of cannabis, those who are convicted of cannabis-related crimes while working, or when an employer finds reasonable evidence to prove wrongdoing in cannabis on the job site. Also in Mass News, the CCC has announced the reopening of its social equity program, which has been on a year-long hiatus. The CCC points to budgetary concerns for the year-long hiatus. The program will come back September 8th with a budget of $10 million less than in previous years. The September 8th cohort will include the 229 applicants accepted last year. For those interested in applying for the social equity program with the CCC, applications open again August 1st. Until then, I've been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
On the West Coast, one of the earliest states to legalize is Oregon. Over the past few months, that state has been the site of a series of violent robberies targeting licensed growers and businesses. Unfortunately, those attacks are continuing despite law enforcement's efforts to stop them. Here's Marianne Cursetjee with her report from Oregon.
I'm Marianne from Alibi with the Oregon Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The Oregon cannabis industry has been plagued with robberies and burglaries for the last couple years. There have been at least 24 documented burglaries of licensed facilities so far this year. Most of the crimes have been committed using stolen vehicles that are rammed through security gates and smashed into buildings. Multnomah County prosecutors, the OLCC, and detectives in Clackamas County and other law enforcement officers announced indictments this week. Ironically, the night before the press conference, 4 more licensees were burglarized, so there is still a lot of work to be done in apprehending these criminals. Businesses and employees are fearful and reeling from losses. Hopefully we have better news as the year goes on. That's the Oregon Cannabis Report. I'm Marianne with Alibi for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Hi, I'm Matthew Friedlander with Skagit Organics, reporting from beautiful Leavenworth, Washington. We just wrapped up the 3rd annual Summer Classic Golf Tournament hosted by the Cannabis Alliance, Washington's largest and most effective cannabis trade group. We were down at the Leavenworth Golf Club just down the road. Great event, super fun, really nice to just get together with community and just have a good time and kind of remember what we're all doing here at the cannabis space. So back to legislation, however, though, we are in the interim of our legislative session, and we are starting to ramp up our review of new and ongoing legislation. There's a effort to revamp our tax structure here in Washington, and there's going to be some legislation to overhaul leadership at the LCP, so the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board. So we are keeping an eye on those 2 pieces of legislation pretty closely. There's a lot of other things we're working on as well, but that's what I've got for you this week out of Washington State. I am Matthew reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
There's been another product recall in New York State, and this is the second one in the past 2 months. This one involves the East End Flower Farm, labeled as harvest. No reports of sickness or any other adverse effects by consumers, but it was a lab called Lexichrome Analytical that passed the products that were pulled from the shelves. When those products were retested, they tested positive for banned pesticides. That lab is no longer allowed to do any more testing in the state of New York, according to the Office of Cannabis Management. The affected products were 1/8 of harvest flower with strain names Secret Number 9, Lemon Haze, and Pure Michigan. Next up, Illinois. Imagine going through the process of licensing and then not being able to open your own licensed business. Plus, 12 drivers who were cited for driving under the influence of cannabis had their cases thrown out after questionable blood testing results. Another example of the challenges with identifying impaired drivers versus drivers who still have traces of THC in their system. Here's Mark Allen and his assistant, Bird, the cat.
What's up, everybody? I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago clone guy. Thanks for tuning in to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is the Illinois Report. This is Bird, as always. Thanks again for tuning in. Interesting news. I recently reported a couple months ago about University of Illinois Chicago. They were doing the blood test results for DUI-related arrests for the state. Well, you know, when they were giving the state flawed results, and they knew it for a while. Well, nothing to see here because UIC hired their own third reviewer, and that reviewer said besides a few, things that should have been modified and, minor mistakes, everything was okay for the most part. So their own third-party reviewer said that they're innocent. That's the police policing the police, just like they always had. These same people, we pay their pensions for them to throw us in jail and keep us in jail. We're paying their pensions for them to do that, but that's a whole nother story. So, long story short, it's still so corrupt now, but now they're reviewing it is on a case-to-case basis. So that being said, in the last week, they've already dropped over 12 cases, more dropping like crazy. They're just quietly dropping them like they do so they don't get sued. It's all about the money and the control and the power, but that's how they operate here in Chicago. Woo, it's crazy, but that's what they do it everywhere. On other interesting news, not so good, the state has over 694 permits that have been allocated for cannabis grows, cannabis infusion, cannabis craft, cannabis commercial grows. The problem is only 382 of them are actually have opened. So that means 65 craft growers have not opened, 38 infusers have not opened, 106 transporting companies have not opened, and 103 dispensaries have not opened. Interesting. It's just interesting times here. Hopefully the state will make the entries to barrier a little easier and these people will get going, but I just thought those were some interesting numbers to share. But that sums up this week's news. For Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago Clone Guy.
I'm Joe Parsons with the Virginia Cannabis Connection by Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WB. And reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. The Virginia Cannabis Control Authority posted an update on social media about the long-awaited online medical patient portal. While they did not announce the specific launch date, they did announce that it will now expand to serve caregivers as well as medical providers and patients. Now, as a medical patient myself, I'm definitely looking forward to better patient access and updates, especially when it comes to information on our medical program. Last week on Coffee Talk, I had an amazing veteran comedian on the show. Dwayne White from Manassas, Virginia, was a 23-year Army vet that served in Iraq and Bosnia and is now a comedian that has been touring the nation and has a comedy special on Amazon Prime called A Boy Named Shannon. Always a funny guy and vet that has been open about how cannabis has helped for PTSD and is becoming more accepted in the military. Be sure to log in to www.3wb.com to watch that awesome episode and more every week at 4:20 on Mondays. And lastly, I'd like to thank my beautiful wife and native princess Pam as my guest this week on Coffee Talk. It was our 18th anniversary this year, and we discussed our cannabis journey together and how she made me the activist and advocate that I am today. My journey has been much easier and enjoyable thanks to her love and support. And I have much more work to do, and I'm glad that she's going to be by my side. Well, that's going to do it from Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WV in Charlottesville, and reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. As always, I'm Joe Parsons. Until next time, stay lifted.
That'll do it for the B Block this week. Next up, the Missouri cannabis community is mourning the loss of an advocacy champion who was a friend of the culture and our own Missouri reporter, Brandon Jones. It's the sad story of Daniel Waxy Jones, and now WPCM TV is stepping up with a live-streamed fundraiser to celebrate his life on the evening of Wednesday, July 30th. That story and more in the details coming up.
A little bit about how you're spreading the word.
Yeah, so I go by Waxy Brown. I've got a 2-hour cannabis talk radio show. It goes down Wednesdays, 3 to 5. I'm brought to you live from the Robust Cannabis Studios at KKID 92.9 out of the Ozarks, where we definitely hold it down. Penny's right up the road from me, too. So before I even get started, though, I'm going to tell you all who I am and where I come from. I just want to give a great big shout out to Pro Cannabis Media, to Brandon Jones, to everybody that put this on and brought these superstars on deck, because anytime I get to share a camera with Penny Lane, I know I'm in the right space. So I appreciate
you.
And she put the ears on for us, everybody. We're getting deep.
What if we're right? What if all of a sudden they discovered that there is medical use for marijuana and that it is good for you and it's better than alcohol and it's better than opioids and it helps your health? What if we're right? What if they find that out?
Specific cannabinoids have medical value. These are facts.
I'm here today in hopes to assist in removing the demonized stigma of cannabis and the perception that cannabis is just about getting high. The true base of this plant has to be known.
I don't think anybody should ever go to jail for cannabis. Get some medicine, and everybody should have access to it.
This is something which, at the very, very least, is the key to alleviating suffering and extending life for millions of human beings. Right? For returning some kind of balance to our society, and quite possibly of restoring our planet's natural balance as well.